There are two questions at the heart of Hamilton the musical. What makes the show work, and what makes Lin Manuel Miranda tick? Those might be two sides of the same coin. Along the way, there are some important choices: how women are portrayed, how slavery is handled, and what's up with that multiracial casting. Lin Manuel Miranda wanted the show to be a story about America then, told by America now. And America now has some issues going on. Race is a thing. Charlottesville saw 6,000 white nationalists openly marching in public, waving banners and carrying torches. There was the death of George Floyd. There are ICE raids, with the Supreme Court ruling that racial profiling in ICE raids is constitutional, and ruling that protections long ingrained in the Voting Rights Act are no longer necessary. The Trump administration is waging war on what it calls diversity, inclusion, and equity programs. It's removed the names of highly qualified people of color from major historical sites. In the Netherlands, there are two panels depicting black soldiers liberating cities after World War II. Both of them have been taken down. There are others and even more egregious examples that are happening right here, closer to home, in the Arlington cemetery. Women's rights are an issue. Abortion bans are proliferating and intrude deeply into basic health care. The right to vote itself has been called into question. There is proposed legislation that would massively reduce the ability of women to vote in the first place, and in a way that it much more dramatically impacts women than men. And representation in entertainment is still an issue. 70% of the Broadway audience is white. A lot of them are tourists, and the majority of the performers are still not people of color. Racial exclusion and marginalization of women are not solved problems, and our current political climate has brought all of that into sharp focus. Right at the onset of all of these increased attacks on racial and gender equity, walk the musical Hamilton in the person of Lin Manuel Miranda. And he makes choices about all of it: about race, about gender, about the music that's going to go into the show, about colonialism, about representation, about Broadway itself. And he's going to get hit with criticism from all sides. That is sort of the price of putting yourself out there, but the best shows and the best performers and the best people can weather it, and they pick the fights that they want to have because they know there are important issues at stake. Well, so far on this podcast, we have had dedicated episodes to each of these topics. We've looked at the way women are treated and race is treated and how slavery is addressed. But today, we are going to look at the guy, Lin Manuel Miranda, what he put into the show, what worked, and how his celebrity is spilled into other political actions on his part. Are the haters right? Did his efforts at creating new spaces and new ideas result in a net step backwards? Is he a hip-hop sellout, or just another rich kid who made good on the back of a family fortune while capitalizing on the ethos of the streets? Those are some heavy topics, but Lin Manuel Miranda didn't shy away from them, and Alexander Hamilton, frankly, didn't shy away from them either, and neither will we. We will sort them all out together on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.
I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and go into a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life. And I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected.
All right, just a couple of procedural notes before we dive into the meat of our subject today. I keep calling Lin Manuel Miranda Manuel Miranda, as if the hyphen comes between the Manuel and the Miranda. It's actually Lin hyphen Manuel. So I'm just going to apologize to him for that, and for any of you that I've confused by pronouncing it that way. My only defense is that I've got a close friend named Luis Manuel Andrade, and so, we call him Manuel Andrade, or at least I do, for reasons that aren't even clear to me. But anyway, I'm just used to the Manuel going with the last name, not the first name, so I will just apologize for that. The correct way you say it is Lin Manuel as a first name and Miranda as a last name. Okay, the second item is that we have some trivia quizzes coming up. If you like trivia, who doesn't? If you've ever done like pub trivia, or if you've gone to a bar and played one of those trivia games, we've got some coming up on musical theater. If you're a musical theater nerd, this is going to be for you. If you listen to these shows, you'll probably be able to get a bunch of them right, but the questions can be challenging. Anyway, that we'll start dropping those on the off weeks in between the main episodes, and we might shift over to that if we take a little break after we do the Hamilton series. But either way, look out for those. I think they're going to be fun, and I hope you give them a try. And finally, I will ask you again, as always, to please share an episode that you like. Hopefully that'll be this one. Thank you, as always, just for listening to the show. I deeply appreciate that. I am trying as hard as I can to keep the show going without having a commercial solicitation or asking you to contribute to money, but times get tough in podcasting, and just getting users together is not really enough anymore. So I will just ask for your help in spreading the word about the show. Hopefully, this show is targeted at smart people who go to watch a musical, and instead of wanting to gossip or talk about who did better in what roles or backstage drama or whatnot, you want to know about the deep backstories and the history behind the show and the central issues they raise and how that matters. Also, hopefully have a little fun along the way. All right. Broadway is a huge audience, as we've talked about before, the huge and growing audience. And I know that I'm appealing to that part of the audience that's got more intellectual curiosity than most. But if that's you, you're probably other people like you, and the people who are most likely to know who else would be interested in that are you yourself. So if you could, please go ahead and share this episode, share an episode that you like. I am just pleading for your help to help spread the word about the show. If it sounds like I'm getting slightly increasingly desperate, well, that's not completely wrong. But we do have a largish and viable audience. We just need to keep it going, and you can make that happen. Okay, so what are we up to today? Well, we're going to get some big context to help understand Lin Manuel Miranda and the show. So we're going to start with a quick history of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican community in New York, which is also called the New Yorican culture. And then we will shift to go do the biography of Lin Manuel Miranda, with the main stops along the way being, of course, the show in the Heights. Then Hamilton, we'll talk a little about what he's doing now, or what he's done since then. Okay, it's a little bit weird to give a history of Puerto Rico, but if you want to understand where Lin Manuel Miranda is coming from, you really have to understand a little bit about Puerto Rico. So this will just be a little 5-10 minute history lesson, the very brief thumbnail sketch of what there is to know about the history of Puerto Rico, because I do think that shows up both in culture, especially people with Puerto Rican descent who live in New York, and in particular with Lin Manuel Miranda. It shows up very centrally in the show. So here we go. What the crap is Puerto Rico? And how does that fit into the New York City art scene? At present, it is what is called a self-governing island commonwealth. It's about 1,000 miles southwest of Florida, and it's in the Caribbean Sea. Now, if your geography is bad as mine, anything that any greater description always helps me. But the Caribbean Sea is the sea that basically separates Central America and South America. It's a great big landmass. On the Pacific Ocean side, which is the far west, it's closed off, and you enter it on the Atlantic side, which is on the far east. That's how you get in there. So if you take Florida, it's that little kind of little panhandle that points south. You keep going past Florida, you get to Cuba, and those are the two spots that you go past and get you into the Gulf of Mexico, which is, of course, now sometimes called the Gulf of America, but that's the first big body of water that is just to the south of North America. So when you leave Texas, you leave Louisiana, you leave Florida, you leave any of those coastal cities, you are now in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, then there's another big chunk, a couple land masses, and you keep going, and the next thing you get to is going to be the Caribbean Sea, and you're going to pass Puerto Rico as one of the last stops that you have before you get into the Caribbean Sea. So if you're heading south, you leave Florida, you're heading southward, turn right, you'll get into the Caribbean Sea, or Caribbean. I'm actually not sure how you say that, but you have to go right past Puerto Rico. So you got to go a long way south of Florida and you'll get to Puerto Rico. That's basically where it is. It was first colonized by Spain in the 1500s, and there's some names you might have heard of, like Ponce de Leon and Francis Drake were involved in the exploration, the conquest, and the military battles there. So after that initial period where the conquistadors arrived and they were populating, colonizing, fair to say, raping and pillaging across South America, that continues for a few centuries. And then under what is called the enlightened despotism of the Spanish Bourbons, it got unified and was made economically valuable. So Puerto Rico was an island with a bunch of different interests there, got unified under the Spanish Bourbons. They made it economically viable. It included crops. They produced like coffee and sugar, and also had slavery. Various colonial powers, including Napoleon, had claimed it. It was sort of a chess piece in the international game of politics between the various powers, which were, like Spain and France and England and to some extent the United States. But by the 1830s, it was then an important source of income for the Spanish government. The Spanish government had unified it. They had made it economically viable, and a large part of the Spanish treasury was dependent on the trade that was coming, the resources it was extracting from Puerto Rico. That was in the 1830s. There was an independence movement in the 1860s, 1868, that got crushed. And then when Queen Isabella was forced to abdicate to a Republican government, Puerto Rico got established with a constitution by the 1870s, and it abolished slavery by 1873. So the Spanish Empire is crumbling. It's becoming sort of a self-governing thing. The U.S. took possession of the island in 1898 following the Spanish-American War. That war was not very bloody. The U.S. declared that they were going to take some stuff over, and they kind of did without too much resistance. But the main thing that the U.S. wanted was a naval base to access the Panama Canal. So in that Caribbean Sea, the far east end of that, right as you're entering that sea, is Puerto Rico. And at the far west end is Panama. So if you wanted to get from the eastern United States to the western United States by sea, you had to go all the way down and around South America. But if you had, say, a canal in Panama, you could cut that travel distance in half. There was a huge advantage to that. And being able to control the Caribbean Sea meant that you could control both its entry in Puerto Rico and its now exit point in Panama. But that was the U.S. interest in it. They could kind of tell that the Caribbean Sea was going to have huge strategic value. And so being able to have rule over Puerto Rico was an advantage to the United States. The U.S. rule was heavy-handed. It was first military rule. The military is not well noted for being especially friendly to civilian government and civil society. That then transitioned to a civilian rule, but was still directly controlled by the United States. And that definitely chafed the Puerto Ricans. As in almost all colonial relationships, there's some great big global power, and there's a local entity would like to have its own determination, make its own decisions about itself. And colonial power usually frustrates that and just exploits the resources of the area. At least that's historically the tension that goes on. What the United States was mostly interested in was Americanizing the population. And so they focused on economic development that tended to increase the rich and the poor gap, so that the higher you were in the social hierarchy, including the big growers, you generally benefited from this period. The further you got from being a big grower or a social elite, if you were a small farmer or if you were a peasant, you got worse off during this time. So U.S. rule between, right when they took over just around the 1900s and the 1930s is economic development, but in the classic way that worked well for rich people and not so great for poor people. In the 1930s, they had something of a New Deal, a major clash between the large and the small growers. And a guy named Luis Muñoz Marin was a key figure for reform. And that sort of led to an independence party and an independence movement. Between 1948 and 1968, it shifts from an agricultural to an industrial economy. And it was mostly rural farmland, definitely in the 1830s. That's when it first became a unified economic entity. It was definitely rural farmland and sugarcane plantations, but it's increasingly urbanized. It is now about 81% urban. English and Spanish are the official languages, and about a fourth of the people who live there now speak English fluently. I kind of raced past what happened with the U.S. military rule, but that probably deserves a little bit more of a deep dive. So just to flesh that out in a little more detail, most of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico is defined by the 1900 Foraker Act and the 1917 Jones Act. The 1917 Act granted citizenship so that if you were a Puerto Rican, you were a citizen of the United States, but you were not allowed to vote in U.S. elections. And local politics is still dictated by key officials who were appointed in the United States. So you don't really get to vote in the U.S. election. You don't even really get too much of a vote in your own local political elections, or at least the most important positions are still appointed in the United States, which is a long way away from where you are. In 1950, there was another act that further refined what had happened in the 1917 acts. There is one resident commissioner is the title that is in the House of Representatives, but that person can't vote either. So if you're in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen who has one representative in the Congress, and that guy can't vote. But they don't pay federal taxes either, and they don't vote in federal elections. The Commonwealth formed its own constitution in 1952 that defines it as a, quote, freely associated state. So Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth, a freely associated state that is linked to the United States. Its residents enjoy U.S. citizenship, but it's definitely sort of in this nether region. Right now, there is one main party in favor of maintaining it as a Commonwealth state. One party wants to get U.S. statehood, so they become full participants in the United States. And then there's a third party that wants complete independence in the United States, and they get about 5% of the vote. And that's sort of just the Wikipedia overview. In 1940, there were about 70,000 native Puerto Ricans living in the United States, and 9 out of 10 of them lived in New York City. Since then, that has spread out a little bit more. There's now people from Puerto Rico living all over the place, including California, which is the other coast, and Texas, which is, another kind of border state there. But for example, in 2014, there were 84,000 people from Puerto Rico left for the United States. So that is an outflow of 84,000 people leaving Puerto Rico, coming to the United States. And 20,000 people went back, but that's a net population outflow of 60,000 people. That was 2014, so a little bit more than a decade ago. But the main beats, there's a lot of immigration that's coming from Puerto Rico to the United States. In 1940, that was almost exclusively in New York City, creating that concentrated New Yorkan culture. And now it is more dispersed, but there's still a healthy amount of immigration coming from Puerto Rico to the United States. The capital and largest city is San Juan. That's got over 1 million people, and it is a tropical climate. It gets 50 inches of rain a year, and it gets hurricanes. In 1899, there was a storm that killed 3,000 people. There were lots of others. And then in the intervening time between 1899 and 2017, and then Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, it killed another 3,000 people. The U.S. relief effort was, let's just call it spotty. And that brought some of those colonial questions and independence and statehood questions into focus. But a hurricane is something that happens. It's a major disaster. They don't have them every year. They don't have big destructive ones, but periodically, every couple of decades, there are major hurricanes that are a big threat to the island. On the whole, the economy is not great. They are much poorer than the United States, but this is exciting. They do have major universities and libraries so that the economy and the commitment to literature and education is not denigrated as a result of their economic situation. That's a cool part of the culture. But notice that the Puerto Rican culture is steeped in an appreciation for language and literature. And some famous Puerto Ricans that you might have heard of include Jose Feliciano, Ricky Martin, and of course, if you watched the Super Bowl last year, Bad Bunny. And they've got some great baseball players. Roberto Clemente was one. In fact, he lost his life going back to try to do a relief effort to Puerto Rico. Was a superstar baseball player, went back, flew back to Puerto Rico in a relief effort, and his plane crashed. That is how he passed away. Orlando Cepeda is another famous Puerto Rican baseball player. And they're more contemporary guys like Ivan Rodriguez, one of the best catchers ever. Yeah, I'm nerding out on baseball, but that's an important part of Puerto Rican culture. I wish Lin Manuel Miranda made it more of a part of his show. Then I could talk about it more. But anyway, so that sort of is the wrap up of what it's like to be from Puerto Rico, what Puerto Rico is like. So if you are from Puerto Rico, you can see that your island is poor. You get to see that you are a U.S. citizen, but clearly a second-class one. When bad stuff happens to you, there's not too much of a response. You're generally forgotten. and there's not too much interest in the United States in the issues that are confronting Puerto Rico. There's a strong New York connection between Puerto Ricans and the United States, that most people have a family member, not most people, but lots of people have a family member who lives in the United States, and probably in New York City, and definitely at some point in New York City. And there's a strong sense of economic inequality, both inside Puerto Rico. You can see that there's a big rich-poor gap, and that is commonly understood, that it is easy to see is connected to that relationship with the United States. The economic inequality, when the United States developed the economy, when the United States pushed its economic policies, they were definitely to the benefit of the wealthy there. And so if you're from Puerto Rico, you can see the economic inequality on your island. And you also can see that is linked to international politics and the relationship with the United States. So those are part of what one experiences if you're part of Puerto Rican culture. Okay, but Lin Manuel Miranda is, of course, a New Yorker. So let's talk a little bit about what that New Yorican identity is. If you're not familiar with New York City, and I'm not myself super familiar with New York City, one thing that I've talked about this previously. One thing that I find that I like New Yorkers. I like most New Yorkers. I really like those people who are New Yorkers and play for the New York Mets. And I like most of their fans. And I even put up with the Yankees fans. But being from New York, everybody's got their ups and their downs. But the downside of people from New York is they always talk about the city as if everybody else knows what Upper East Side means. Like, upper, what is upper? Like, don't you have to know where you're standing to know where upper is? Anyway, so I'm going to try to make sense of this. I have to do this for myself every time. So if you're not from New York City, this is for you. If you are from New York City, my apologies. There is a large chunk of New York that is called the El Barrio neighborhoods in New York City. Those are frequently referenced in the Heights, especially in what is called the Lower East Side, and in particular in Alphabet City. That's on the very south part of Manhattan, so New York. Okay, so there's, of course, the Atlantic Ocean to the east. And then there's a couple land masses that include Brooklyn and Long Island. And then there's little inlets there. And then the Hudson River runs north and south. So there's the Atlantic Ocean, there's some land masses, and then there's a Hudson River. And right next to the Hudson River is the island of Manhattan, which is, of course, a big, important thing now. So when we're talking about the Lower East Side, that's the very south part of Manhattan, which is that island that's kind of right in the middle of it. Just for perspective, Times Square is about in the middle of that. And if you go a little bit further north, you get the Yankee Stadium. Immediately to the west, so there's that Hudson River that is on the west side of Manhattan. And if you cross that river, you are now in New Jersey. And in particular, you can get to Weehawken, which is where Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had their famous duel. Anyway, so in that period in the 1940s, where almost all the Puerto Rican immigrants were living in New York City, there was a concentrated chunk of that in southern Manhattan, which is called, for reasons I don't know, the Lower East Side. It's called the El Barrio neighborhood. And that's all gentrified since then. So there are people who are Broadway historians that know more about this than I do. But Broadway was sort of a rundown, wrong side of the tracks kind of a place. And it got renovated in the 1980s. And so Broadway was sort of the seedy place, but then it exploded in the 1980s. Of course, Cats shows up then. Broadway gets renovated, and then it becomes a tourist attraction. Times Square is. And so very generally speaking, starting in the 1980s, everything got economically renovated and probably gentrified. And so that place that is called Alphabet City in the south part, also called Hell's Kitchen down there, is now not the same place that it was in the 1940s. But between the 40s and the 80s, it was definitely very poor, ethnically concentrated with Puerto Ricans. That's the El Barrio part of New York City. That's where all this stuff is happening. Now, to identify what the culture was like there, I'm going to turn to Regina Bernard Carreno, who is writing in a journal called Counterpoints in 2010. So this is prior to Hamilton. This is just talking about what the New Yorican culture is like. Regina Bernardo Carreno teaches at the City University of New York. That's called CUNY, and was born in that Hell's Kitchen area. And she describes the identity, what is a New Yorican identity, how they were portrayed, and talks about the unique art that it spawned. Okay, so how does the dominant culture, how did white culture look at this El Barrio Puerto Rican section of New York? This is from Oscar Lewis, who is not a person of color, but is an anthropologist who studied, as an outsider would come in and study the culture. And he described it this way, quote, depicted wife-abusing, drunken, and unemployed stereotypes of Puerto Rican males who suffered from machismo because their spouses were whores. Nuyorican, end quote. That's not the most flattering picture of a culture. The males are overly macho criminal types that abuse their broken families. That view was mirrored in a 1976, get this, U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report, which referred to, quote, Puerto Rican problems, end quote, and it didn't really discuss the role of colonialism in creating that. There are other sources to make references to frequent violent crime, including gang rapes. And as another element of that culture, the Puerto Rican neighborhoods were sort of a flashpoint for the 1980s crack epidemic. So the poorer parts of New York, that was where, when you think to the 1980s and that street crack problem, cocaine generally was exploding as a problem in the United States. The street version of that was crack, and those Puerto Rican neighborhoods were flashpoints for that was going on. So that was the way white America generally viewed the El Barrio portion of New York, that Nuyorican culture. And, if you watch the West Side Story, you kind of get a glimpse of that. It's definitely the Broadway version, so it's not quite as brutal, but what are Puerto Ricans like? They are criminals. The women are sexually available, let's call it. And the men are violent criminals. Okay. With that being the way that the white culture was looking at Puerto Ricans, the Puerto Rican authors themselves started to articulate their own vision of who they were. In 1970, there was a book published called Memoria de Bernardo Vega, which was about a cigar factory worker who organized and empowered factory workers. In 1967, Piri Thomas wrote a book called, quote, Down These Mean Streets. Here is a quote from Bernard Carreno's article. Quote, Thomas describes the grit and grime and joy of living in New York City's El Barrio from the 1930s to the 1960s. His story captivates readers not only because the struggle of Puerto Ricans is evident throughout the text, but so are the racial injustices served by everyone towards the other, end quote. From the outside, they were just portrayed as criminals. Many of these artists and people living there themselves would describe, okay, it sucks. There's some poverty here. Nobody likes poverty, but there's also some joy here. And part of our struggle is with that dominant culture that has all these very racist views about who we are. There is lots of poetry that springs up at this time. One movement in particular is called the, quote, first draft movement. And it avoided what the article describes as, quote, university and academic styles of writing. It believed in the art of making a mistake when writing poetry, end quote. So the idea was to speak in a unique, authentic way. And that meant not trying to sound like you were not writing Lord Byron's sonnets. You weren't writing Shakespeare. You were writing in a way that expressed who you were. And so that first draft style, it could include mistakes. The most important thing was not that it was beautiful and polished, but that it was authentic. Now, as with all things within that movements of poetry and those art movements and that culture, there are many contradictions and tensions, which happen in every culture. And part of that was finding a way of writing that wasn't part of the dominant culture. Part of that was there was still some tension between the Nuyorican living in New York and people who were still living on the island. There was a clash between second generation and first generation authors. Do the kids really get it? Or are they just commercial sellouts and copycats? And sometimes the second generation authors would say that the first generation authors screwed it up, which is why we had to do what we did. And then, of course, there was always commercialism that destroyed everything once you're trying to write in an authentic voice that represents your culture, and then money comes along to be made, then the question is, does that commercialism make the second and third generation sellouts? Do the kids who did not take the heat to create that original type literary style in the first place, but went on to commercialize, got the money from it, is that okay? Those are tensions that tend to happen in almost all art movements and all literature movements and in every culture, but that was definitely going on in that Nuyorican section. So I guess what I'm saying is you don't want to over glamorize it, make it seem like it was just about strong communities. There was definitely crime. You don't want to say there was just this authentic voice that came out of that because there were the same fights that you would have in any artistic movement. But what you could say is there was a vibrant culture that definitely had some difficulties that were associated with poverty. It was definitely the case that the Puerto Ricans, the New Yorkers themselves, could see part of that was the racism that they were experiencing, the way they were viewed and treated by the dominant white culture. There was a white culture that was totally oblivious of that. It was just treating it like, who are all these criminals and prostitutes that are living in Hell's Kitchen? And in the midst of all that, there was also this, the Puerto Rican culture had all those libraries and all those universities. And so it was definitely focusing on poetry and literature. And that was sort of developing its own voice in the midst of all those cultural tensions. What did it all have in common? Well, the idea behind the Puerto Rican literature and the poetry was that it would articulate the challenges. It would acknowledge the violence in the street culture, but it would insist on the humanity of the Puerto Ricans and the extent to which poverty is the product of a cultural force, especially colonialism. If you're denied economic opportunity, and once things start to gentrify and you're on the wrong side of that question, there tend to be upward and downward spirals. There's less of a sense that these poets had the right answer. Then there was a really big challenge that they had to face, and they kind of know it. Now, if you see the seeds of Lin Manuel in this culture of street poetry, well, so do I. He's obviously committed to hip hop as a street way of articulating ideas. And that seems to be a very direct product of that New Yorker culture. And so sort of the very first connection that I can see between Lin Manuel Miranda and the history of Puerto Rico, in particular, the New Yorker street poetry tradition, there's a pretty straight line between that and the rise of hip hop. That street poetry that comes out of that New Yorker El Barrio section of New York that was sort of defined by poverty and ethnic concentration between 1930 and about 1980. You can see that poetry and that language comes out of that goes into hip hop. And then you can draw a pretty straight line between that street poetry, the rise of hip hop, and then obviously Hamilton, where hip hop is a central feature. And then Lin Manuel Miranda himself would then draw a connection between that and the founders who he thought used those words to fight their battles and form a country. Now, I will just say that's kind of true. Lin Manuel Miranda is not wrong that ideas and words were a key part of the American Revolution, but so were guns and beer and drunken brawls. But let us just focus on, there's a line, if you were to say Puerto Rico's got a tradition of literature, the New Yorker section of New York developed its own form of street poetry that played a key role in the development of hip hop, which then obviously led pretty directly to the Hamilton musical. And then Lin Manuel says, and if you draw back even further, you can see the use of words as having political power and being super important all the way back to the Revolution. Okay, so that is sort of the background of the New Yorker, Puerto Rico, and the New Yorker identity. We have now got ourselves up to where we can start talking about Lin Manuel Miranda in particular and what he did with his life, career, and how that resulted in Hamilton. Okay, so he is born in 1980, the same year I entered high school, sadly. His mom is a clinical psychologist and kind of a big shot. She's on a lot of boards, like she's really good at her job and is prominent in the mental health profession. And his dad, Luis Miranda Jr., is a political consultant. Now, his dad was born and raised in Puerto Rico, moved to New York City when he was 18, got a scholarship from New York University, which is a pretty good school, got his BA from the University of Puerto Rico, and then got a graduate psych degree from the New York University. So he went to one of those well-regarded Puerto Rican universities and then went on to New York, finish his grad work in New York City. But then he became a political consultant. In the 1980s, he worked for Ed Koch. He was the director of the mayor's office on Hispanic affairs. He was part of the New York City Health and Hospitals Board. In 1980, he was appointed chairman of that board by Rudy Giuliani. Wow, that guy went from America's mayor to sort of a public embarrassment, but was a big deal in 1993. Was, the mayor of one of the biggest cities and most important cities of the world. And he was Luis Miranda Jr., the dad of Lin Manuel Miranda, is working closely enough with that guy that he is appointed as the chairman of the board. He is a political consultant for both Clinton and Chuck Schumer. He helped a guy named Fernando Ferrer, Ferrer, who ran for mayor in 2005. He didn't win either time, but he was the political consultant for Letitia James, the current Attorney General of New York. She was the first Black woman to serve as Attorney General and actually the first Black female to hold statewide office in New York City. Now, if her name seems vaguely familiar, there is a reason for that. She, as the Attorney General, won a $400 million civil judgment against Donald Trump. The actual judgment was stuck in appeals. And then she was herself indicted in October of 2025 by Donald Trump's Department of quote unquote justice. That seems now just to be another arm that he wields to take out punishment on his political enemies. But as a sign of how serious that indictment was, it was issued in October of 2025 and dismissed in November of 2025. Note the speed of those dates, but that is an important connection that the Miranda family had, and surely something that Lin Manuel was very aware of. He's been on lots of other boards since 1990. He's the founder and the first president of the Hispanic Federation. He is a board member at the Public Theater. He is a hustling immigrant and a political mover and shaker. Now, I'm avoiding the term insider here. It is true that it's easy to take pot shots at people who want to go into politics. And it is true that a lot of politics is saying things publicly, trying to stick to them. Political winds shift. Sometimes compromises are necessary. You are treated unfairly by the media and by your opponents. It has always been thus. It was certainly true of Alexander Hamilton, but Louis Miranda was a mover and shaker in New York politics in the 1980s, right as Lin Manuel was growing up. His dad was involved in politics in the same way Alexander Hamilton was. In the city, it is a big, thriving city. How do you make a difference in this one? Well, you go into politics, and Luis Miranda did that, and Lin Manuel had a front row seat for all of it. Now, I mentioned that his mother, Luz, L-U-Z is how it's spelled, Towns Miranda, was also born in Puerto Rico. She was also involved in advocacy. She's focused her medical practice and career on underserved groups. She's worked on Puerto Rican hurricane relief. She's been on the New York State Psychology Board since 2025 and is a member of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund Board. She is just as accomplished as her spouse, Luis, just a little more in the academic realm, so that you would know her more if you were into the mental health side of what was going on in New York City, and you would know Luis more if you were into the political side. Lin Manuel himself, is named after a poem about the Vietnam War by the Puerto Rican writer Jose Manuel Torres Santiago. The family has two kids. He's got an older sister who I think is also named Luz. Plus, they have an adopted brother, just like Alexander Hamilton. If you listen to the last episode, you know that in the Hamilton family, they had 8 biological children, and they raised another person, another kiddo who was without a home that was raised by Alexander Hamilton, sort of quasi-adopted. And the Miranda family also had an adopted brother. And he spent at least 1 month, Lin Manuel did, each summer with his grandparents back in Puerto Rico. So the connection, that New Yorican connection, was very strong in his family. He attended Hunter College Elementary School and high school. Now, that's a public high school, Hunter College Public High School, but it is a magnet school. It tries to draw good students. And per the Wikipedia footnotes, quote, students accepted by Hunter represent the top 1/4% of students in New York City based on test scores, end quote. Yeah, so it is one of the best, but troublingly elite forms of public education. So to get in, Lin Manuel must have had phenomenal test scores. It catered to the best students in New York City, and it is based on test scores. So the good news is it's super high quality, but it's public education. Anybody who can test in can get in. The downside is there's problems with test scores for sure, and having a score in the top 1/4% to get in does make it's definitely an elite education, whether it's public or not. But it is an academic accomplishment for sure. And Lin Manuel goes there. He meets his future spouse. One of his classmates is also the rapper now named Immortal Technique, who originally bullied Lin Manuel Miranda, but later became friends. And while in high school, Lin Manuel Miranda started writing musicals there. The most interesting one was The Nightmare about a fetal pig that he had to cut up in biology class. I'm going to call that a horror musical. I'm hoping there was some comedy in there. But as early as high school, when he got involved in musical theater, his dream was he wanted to be in Les Miserables. which is a big show. If you're interested in that and all, then we've got a bunch of episodes on that on this very podcast. You can learn more about it. Okay, he goes to the elite Hunter College High School, and from there he goes on to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And that's also elite. It's got like a 5% acceptance rate, maybe a little bit higher now. It kind of vacillates, but it's an interesting place. It's a smallish town in Connecticut. It has the first ever film library in the United States. So, the film industry is created in the early 1900s. And one of the first places that starts thinking, hey, we got to start making an archive of some of these films. The first place that does that anywhere is Wesleyan in Connecticut. It's got still one of the best film libraries in the United States. It is also where the seances of Victor Hugo were translated. So if you are interested in Les Miserables and you're interested in what the crap's going on with the seances there, that's also in one of our past episodes. Joss Whedon of Buffy the Vampire fame also attended there. And most importantly, that is where my spouse went. She went to Wesleyan University, graduated before Lin Manuel got there, but whatever. Lin Manuel Miranda's wife, Vanessa Nadal, went there. I believe they met in high school. I don't know if she went to Wesleyan, but she graduated from MIT, and so did my wife. So basically, Lin Manuel Miranda and I are genetically connected. He's married to somebody who went to MIT. I'm married to somebody who went to MIT. He went to Wesleyan. My spouse went to Wesleyan. He has 2 children. Lin Manuel Miranda named his eldest child Sebastian, named after, weirdly, the crab from The Little Mermaid. My eldest child's middle name is Sebastian, which we picked just because we liked it. Definitely not after the crab in The Little Mermaid. My eldest child does not like Sebastian as the middle name. But anyway, weird connection. Anyway, yes, what I'm saying is that Lin Manuel Miranda and I are cosmically connected. Anyway, Wesleyan University is where he got his undergraduate education. He entered there in 1998. And as a sophomore in 1999, he started writing the earliest cantations of In the Heights. That production got accepted by the Student Theater Company, so they got produced at Wesleyan University. He also did some Shakespeare while he was there, and he also ate a lot of meals at the local convenience store / sandwich shop. Not exactly a bodega, but what a bodega would be like if you were in rural Connecticut or, like the bucolic Connecticut. It's kind of this cool little convenience store. They've got sandwiches that they make, so you can go in and get some counter service, order the sandwiches to go there. Lin Manuel Miranda ate there enough that the owner knew him by name by the time he graduated. And after Lin Manuel made it big, he came back to that same convenience store and gave them autographed copies of his multi-platinum CDs, which are still on display there, which I know because my daughter toured that college just last summer. Anyway, enough about the trivia of his time at Wesleyan University. He graduates in 2002, and the important thing is those are 2 pretty good incubator schools. That Hunter College High School is a pretty doggone good high school, and Wesleyan University is a great place, pretty good place to go to college, especially if you want to go into the arts. Okay, so at this point, I just want to pause and let's draw a couple more connections between Lin Manuel Miranda and Alexander Hamilton. They both had a good education due to very early intellectual promise. That Hamilton, of course, famously showed some academic promise on the island of St. Croix when he was a kid, and they took up a collection after a hurricane, of all things, and sent him to New York City, where he went in. He got into Columbia and graduated from that place. And Lin Manuel Miranda, on the basis of his test scores, got into Hunter High School and then went on to Wesleyan University. They are both from the Caribbean. That Lin Manuel's roots go 1 generation back to Puerto Rico. Hamilton's was from St. Croix. They're separated by about 100 miles, so closer than I am to Los Angeles. And they both had a sense of being on the wrong side of colonialism. For Alexander Hamilton, the big colonial power was, of course, Britain. And for Lin Manuel Miranda, ironically, it's the United States and its relationship to Puerto Rico. But both had the sense of what it was like to be the smaller country that is getting exploited by a larger, more powerful country. And both of them had the drive to make a more just world, which necessarily involved changing the world. And for both of them, that had to involve politics. They were also both connected to the immigrant experience. Alexander Hamilton was, of course, a first-generation immigrant. Lin Manuel Miranda was the second, but definitely had close connections between his home country. Difference is that Alexander Hamilton was not nearly as connected to his origins as Lin Manuel Miranda was. There is an argument that he was the founder who was most connected with the nation because he was not connected to any colony. So if you were Thomas Jefferson, did you believe in the United States? Yes. If you had to pick between the United States and Virginia, what did you pick? Oh, well, most of them picked Virginia. But for Hamilton, it was a no-brainer. He was like, I have no connection to where I came from. I believe only in the United States, which is probably why he was so into federal power. Most people have talked about why he was a proponent of a strong federal government and less power for the states. And then, Hamilton, of course, famously wrote the Federalist Papers, arguing for the strong federal government, and maybe that's why. So that is a difference between them. But I will say that both saw politics and government posts as a way that you moved up. If you want to change the world, kind of have to get involved with politics. Now, for Alexander Hamilton, it was, I went to college, I got my education, I was almost immediately put into the military because that's what one did in the Revolutionary War, and that is what led me to politics. Now, for Lin Manuel Miranda, of course, it was art and entertainment is sort of where he cut his teeth, and then from there went into politics, and we'll talk about his politics in a bit. But for both of them, those are three overlapping Venn circles, but it's all about how do you change the world. So for Hamilton, how do you change the world? Well, you join the military because there's a war going on. You got to win that war. That war will change history. And from there, you can go into politics. And for Lin Manuel Miranda, how do you change the world? Well, you change it with your art, you change it with your entertainment. And if you're successful enough, you can then not just change minds and project images of the way the world could be and a political vision, but then you could enter the concrete world of politics. For Lin Manuel Miranda, he learned about politics by watching his dad. And for Hamilton, he learned it by watching George Washington. Arguably, George Washington is a more accomplished politician than Luis Miranda, but many accounts have that Washington sort of was looked at as everybody's dad, and Hamilton definitely looked at him as a surrogate dad. And so one other connection was for Lin Manuel Miranda and for Hamilton, they both kind of had these father figures that modeled for them how one engaged in politics. Okay, so as a summary, it is easy to see how a history teacher and enthusiast like Lin Manuel Miranda saw a good story in the life of Alexander Hamilton. He's both kind of like him, and he embodies a lot of what Lin Manuel Miranda believes in. They're not exactly the same guy, but they've got definite, obvious things in common. You can see the connection there. Okay, how does he go from fresh out of college kid in 2002 to a lead role in Broadway in 2008? He takes a look at his college experience. He's got the show In the Heights that he believes in. He starts adding collaborators. One of them is director Thomas Kail. He premieres it at a regional theater in Connecticut in 2005. So it takes him 3 years to get out of college before he finally gets at a regional theater. In musical theater time, that's pretty quick, but long 3 years if you're trying to make ends meet out of college. Goes from Connecticut in 2005, makes it to off-Broadway in 2007. That's a jump, but the bigger jump is to Broadway itself in 2008. It gets nominated for 13 Tony Awards. Now, that's quite a feather to have in your cap, especially for your first foray into musical theater on Broadway, but he's accomplished that. In the Heights is eventually made into a movie in 2021. That is after Hamilton, so that's a long time. But the development actually started in 2008. So he's got a pretty good show. In the Heights, 13 Tony nominations is nothing to snicker at. But we are not here to dwell on that. So how does he get from In the Heights to Hamilton? Well, he has got other stuff going on. He's got a Spanish language version of the West Side Story that he did as part of a collaboration with Sondheim. So trying to culturally reclaim that story a little bit. He does Bar and Button. Oh my God, I love this guy. He is an English teacher at his former high school. He's got assorted musical projects and collaborations. Those include commercials and a song that he does specially for the 2014 Tonys. In 2013, he has a hip hop group that plays at the Edinburgh Film Festival. Now, I will say the Edinburgh Film Festival has got one heck of a backstory, but it is now sort of this very large, very prominent, experimental, what you might expect, theater festival. So lots of big names go there, lots of starting out people go there. It's just totally nuts. But his show is called the Freestyle Love Supremes. It got good reviews. It wasn't a major commercial success, but that was one of the many things that he was doing. He's involved with a Broadway version of Bring It On. Okay, Do you know what Bring It On was? I thought I knew what it was. And I was like, yeah, it can't possibly be it. And I looked it up, but it was, in fact, the movie about competitive high school cheerleading. It's got some dance in it. It's got some music, I guess. It's got some racial questions that it raises, but it is basically, a cheerleading vehicle show. And in 2014, he played in a revival of Jonathan Larson's Tick Boom. Jonathan Larson, of course, famously did Rent, and he had another show before it that was not nearly the commercial success. I don't think it ever got produced in Jonathan Larson's lifetime, but if you're a theater nerd, which Lin Manuel Miranda definitely was, it was a show that you wanted to be a part of. So I am just mentioning that for the awesome array of stuff that Lin Manuel Miranda is doing. It almost looks like it's just anything that sounds fun or interesting or that he might be able to do something with. He says yes to, including bar mitzvahs, including being a high school teacher, including commercials. But he's out there. He's definitely got some hustle going on. Okay, as all that is going on, he's on vacation in 2008, and he reads Schernau's book about Alexander Hamilton. And that is the genesis of what is going to become, of course, the Hamilton play. And while reading it, he starts thinking, how would I make this into a theater production? And at some point there has the idea that he's going to integrate hip hop into the show. Artistically, that's sort of what the show relies on. So let's just talk about what is it? He reads the Chernow book. He develops the show. What are the elements that he's putting into the show that makes the show work, or that are at least significant choices that he made, risks that he took to see if it would work? I will spend the entire next episode just talking about the hip hop component of this show. But artistically, that's kind of the heart of the show, right? It relies on the hip hop style. That's the first thing he decides, is that the founders built this nation on words, and that kind of came out of Chernow's book and probably out of his own readings of history. But also, and that is what hip hop does. Hip hop makes comments about culture. It makes political statements. It is the language of America today. And so he sees that connection, decides, all right, we're going to do hip hop. But of course, the show has some other elements. Now, most of these things we have given their own episodes in the series already. I'm just going to recap and add a few more details. Almost the entire show is wrapped. There's very little dialogue that is spoken and not part of the show. I think there's 47 songs. So it is almost all sung or music performed. It's got multiracial casting. The idea is to tell the story of America then, what it was like in 1776, with a cast that looks like America now, with the idea being that will create connections in both directions, that will take contemporary audiences and make the history part more relevant to them. And it will help reclaim history to say that it isn't really just the story of great white men. That is the story of all Americans. And especially, if the theme is equality, let's focus on what it could have been like, and how that equality theme rings true for all Americans and not just those white guys. It's got a strong pro-immigration message in the show for sure. Now, that's a little bit problematic because Hamilton himself, the historic Alexander Hamilton, was not that big on immigration. As an immigrant himself, you would have thought he'd be more sympathetic, but no. And, even politically today, the immigrants, people who have recently immigrated, are not always the most staunch advocates for immigrants coming in. In particular, he was a strong advocate of what are called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, those Alien Acts were not pro-alien. They particularly took away First Amendment free speech rights from aliens. So there were 4 of them. They were super unpopular. They gave the president the power to essentially shut down any press or to deport any alien that they thought was acting contrary to the national interest. Even President Adams did not want to use those powers. And of those 4 acts, 3 of them got repealed within 5 years. But Hamilton, the whole time, was like, why aren't we using these things more? Let's shut down more presses. Let's deport more people. So that element of the show is a little bit concerning, but it is largely historically accurate with some artistic corrections that most people are okay with. I'm just going to give you a kind of a flavor of the connection between history and the show. There's a bar scene at the very beginning of the musical where these guys are hanging out, drinking. There's a scene, kind of a comic scene where they're sort of drunk. Those characters could not have met in real life because they weren't in the city at the same time. They did, of course, interact at some point, but they weren't all like buddies hanging out in the same bar at the same time. In the show, he's shown as an abolitionist. It's a little more complicated than that. I encourage you to give our episode on whether or not Hamilton owned slaves a listen on that. He probably did have something to do with slave ownership, engaged it professionally as a lawyer, but then founded the Manumission Society, was the president of it. Some have taken issue with the fact that he's portrayed as a strong abolitionist. One reading of history is that he was. One was that that's overstated. In the show, the eldest of the Schuyler sisters, Angelica, says that she has to marry up because there are no males in the family. That's not necessarily true in real life. She actually did have some brothers, and the family was probably doing okay. So that part of the show is exaggerated. And the big historical issue that is quite a bit different is that the presidential election of 1800 wasn't really the reason that the duel happened between Burr and Hamilton. It was Burr's loss in the New York governor's election in 1804. And in particular, some really nasty letters that Hamilton sent to some friends of his that were intercepted by spies that Aaron Burr had. Maybe that's too much detail to put in a show, but wow, what a weird historical thing. But awesomely, once those letters were discovered, they had to then agree to duel each other. And so they did, in fact, send each other a bunch of trash-talking letters, which they did, in fact, sign with the closing salutation, "Your obedient servant." So, the letters were like, "You suck, I hate you, and you're a liar, comma, your obedient servant, Alexander Hamilton." Anyway, most of the show is historically accurate. It is based heavily on Chernow. And the show is largely credited for getting interest in history and got more school kids interested, got more adults interested in talking about history. And most of the things that it changed were for artistic purposes and are generally forgivable. But I will say there are two things about the historical orientation of the play that probably are worth considering. The first is that history has sort of vacillated between Jefferson and Hamilton. They did hate each other. They did have very opposite views of what America should be. And kind of over time, the more history and historians like Thomas Jefferson, the less they tend to like Hamilton. And the more they like Hamilton, the less people tend to like Jefferson. And this show and the book that it's based on is a pretty one-sided view of Hamilton. That Hamilton is kind of made out as the hero. Now, you probably have to do that to create the emotional power and the artistical value of the show. But historically, if you were to look at that and you were to say, is the show historically accurate? And I think you could come away saying, well, this is probably the best case you could make for Hamilton, but that probably then takes his side of history a little more than it takes Jefferson, and a more balanced historical viewpoint would probably not be as pro-Hamilton as this one is. And then the second thing about the show is that it is a little heavily influenced by Chernow. That's good to a point. Theater people are in theater because they're good at theater, but they're not usually trained researchers for historical methods. If you read Chernow in his 800-page book, that's pretty good, but you tend to stop there. And then I think what historians would tend to do is, nope, you keep reading, right? You got to read. You're not ready to write something when you've read one book about Hamilton. You got to read all the 800 books about Hamilton just to illustrate it. And maybe this is a humble brag, but to put together the episodes for this podcast, I have looked up 50 different sources with multiple different books. And I will say that not everybody agrees with Chernow, that there are other points of view. And so this show, you can tell, has gotten the Chernow fingerprints all over it, which is okay. That's better than a lot of shows do, but is not the kind of well-rounded history that you like. So if you're just looking for good entertainment, great. If you're looking at something that raises interesting historical points that you're going to track down, for example, listening to a podcast that has some deep dives about those episodes, that's great. But I would not uncritically say this was a well-researched historical account of Alexander Hamilton. So I'm going to watch the show and come away thinking that I know a bunch of stuff about history. It's that there are definitely some punching. But just as a closing thought, Hamilton was a complicated guy. He wrote the Federalist Papers. There's probably not a constitution without those Federalist Papers. And he also had a huge role in getting the Constitutional Convention in the first place and getting the Constitutional Convention to rewrite it. I've made it that side comment a couple times. I'm probably going to do an episode just on that. But there is probably not a constitution without Alexander Hamilton. And if there is, at least it's not a strong federal constitution. And he also, of course, did the Treasury. He founded that, and he saved the United States from bankruptcy and did so almost single-handedly, which I've now been saying over and over in a bunch of different episodes. But in case you haven't heard the other one, he totally did. The United States was broke when the Constitution passed, and it was probably going to not survive. More than one major world power has fallen apart because it was bankrupt. The United States started bankrupt, and the guy who saved us from bankruptcy was Alexander Hamilton. He did so by founding the Treasury, then becoming the head of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, and then by doing it well. All right, so that's a lot. Boy, that is writing history, that your life is changing history. And those are some good stuff. But he also, was a big advocate of the Alien and Sedition Acts. He was also associated with slavery and definitely was married into the family that had many slaves. But he also founded the Manumission Society. So he's a complicated guy. Now, if you read all that history and you hate Alexander Hamilton, and there are some smart people who do, especially those for whom slavery is a key issue. If you hate Hamilton, you're going to hate the show. And if you don't like shows about founders, you are also going to not like the show. So those are, that's just kind of the caveat. The closing thoughts about what is the relationship between that show Hamilton and accurate history. If you're into history and you have read, your reading of history is that Hamilton was a jerk, and that is not the conclusion that Chernow has, and you have an informed opinion that's the opposite of what Chernow has, you're probably not going to like the show. And you can fault the show for not having accurate history. The second thing I will say is that Lin Manuel Miranda is definitely a progressive to moderate Democrat. He's definitely of the Obama approach that works within the system. Use government to make changes. If you're a person of color and you got to play ball with white people to get to high office so that you can make some changes and get things like healthcare passed, well, that's okay. But there are a lot of people for whom that is not enough, right? That people who do not like that work within the system, relatively moderate approach. And if you're one of those, you're just not going to like what Lin Manuel Miranda is doing. So those are just sort of the boundary conditions of the show and the politics of the show that I just want to highlight at the end of talking about what are the show, what are its politics, what are its choices. Okay, so the show ends, or the show is now developing, right? In 2008, he's read this book. In 2009, he's invited to perform at the White House, and he starts to perform early versions of those songs. He starts doing extended sets with different versions of the songs as kind of quasi-musical hip-hop performances at various venues. And finally, all that culminates in January 2015 when it debuts at the Public Theater, which is off-Broadway Place. You will remember that his dad is on the board at the Public Theater, so that's a good choice. But it does really well off Broadway. And then by August 6th of 2015, it opens at the Richard Rodgers Theater on Broadway. It opens to both shows, both the off-Broadway and the Broadway version, have almost unanimously positive reviews. They sell out. They set box office records. I'm going to detail those in a second. And I will say, the critical review is, most people say it's universally positive. That's not exactly true. Not all reviews are glowing, but nobody really pans it. And the people who don't like it tend to say, well, sure, it's entertaining, but the history's wrong, or I couldn't really enjoy the show because the history was so terrible. Nobody really panned it. There were some negative reviews, but if you wrote one of those early negative reviews in 2015, you're now sort of embarrassed by it, or you are in the very, very small minority. Most people and most reviewers absolutely love the show when it opens. It has Tony nominations in 2016, so it opens in 2015, and it gets 16 nominations. That's a record, and it won 11 of them. In April of 2016, so right as we're approaching those Tonys, there's this awesome time where he freestyle raps. Lin Manuel Miranda goes to the White House and freestyle raps based on cards that Obama himself holds up. Also in April of 2016, there is a profit-sharing deal with the cast. Now, this is a big deal that most Broadway shows are structured so that the performers work on contract. They're paid a certain amount for a certain number of performances. If you're really good, it's lucrative. But if the show makes billions of dollars, as Hamilton does, that those profits all go to the producers and they don't go back to the cast. So for Lin Manuel Miranda to step into that and say, hey, this is basically an unfair economic structure. This is a lot like colonialism, where the producers are in the role of the colonizers and the performers are in the role of the indigenous people. I'm not cool with that. It's not usual to have a Broadway show set up that that has profit sharing. And it's definitely a very progressive thing. It's not just money, it's power structure. And that happened at the behest of Lin Manuel Miranda, that I think his show was about equality and that he wanted the show to embody that. And part of that was getting that profit sharing deal. He left the lead role on July 9, 2016, but he vowed to return. He did sporadically go there. He moved the show, or at least there was a traveling version of the show in Puerto Rico where he did reprise the role to, he now had a hot commodity, the hottest musical theater commodity in the world, and he took it back to Puerto Rico to help them out. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then in November of 2016, there is the famous Mike Pence controversy. Brandon Victor Dixon, who played the role of Aaron Burr, finished one of their performances that Mike Pence, the recently elected Mike Pence, was the vice president-elect. He shows up for the show, and it's a big deal. Like, what the heck is this guy, this Trump acolyte doing at the show? And so the producers, including Lin Manuel Miranda, put together a statement, and the performer reads it. I'm going to read it to you. Vice President-elect Pence, we welcome you and truly thank you for joining us here at Hamilton, an American musical. We really do. We, sir, we are the diverse America who are alarmed and anxious that your new administration will not protect us, our planet, our children, our parents, or defend us and uphold our inalienable rights, sir. But we truly hope that this show has inspired you to uphold our American values and to work on behalf of all of us. All of us. Again, we truly thank you for seeing the show, this wonderful American story told by a diverse group of men and women of different colors, creeds, and orientations, and quotes. They are saying, we are worried that your new administration isn't going to keep us safe. Well, Pence later came out and said that he wasn't offended, but Trump typically was, and he boycotted a movement to hashtag boycott Hamilton. He thought it was in poor taste that the cast was, in his words, harassing Mike Pence. But as, tweet storms go and as Trump's ire goes, it was kind of a one-off tweet insult, not really a sustained attack. And then the true irony was, of course, that the guy who really needed to worry about his safety was Mike Pence himself, who was famously hanged in effigy. And had he been present at the insurrection in January 6th of 2020, probably would have been killed by that very crowd. So when, those performers were saying, hey, we're worried that our rights aren't going to be protected and that violence will be allowed to run unchecked, and they were telling Mike Pence, it ended up being more prophetic for Mike Pence than it was. Well, it was prophetic for a lot of people, but boy, irony upon irony that Mike Pence was one of the first contacts between that show, Hamilton, and the Trump administration. The boycott didn't catch on, of course, and it became a bit of a joke because, the show had been sold out for 7 months in advance. So the call for a boycott was, after the horse had left the barn, let's call for a closing of the barn doors. It was sort of a blip, but just sort of a notable political moment. So that's November of 2016. By 2017, the show starts touring. There's also this thing that happens with, it's called Ham for Ham. It was an outdoor pre-show for lottery ticket entrance. So if you didn't have tickets, you could enter a lottery. It was hosted by cast members. It was kind of a way to get more people involved. You could cynically view it as a marketing tactic, but hundreds of people would show up for this. But it became so popular that it actually caused traffic congestion. So they had to move to an online thing. And then the online ticket lottery was so popular that the first day it opened, 50,000 people logged in and the server got crashed. So that was all trouble. That was just a sign of how popular the show was. But it was also very within the equity theme of the show to try to get some more popular. Like, if you're not one of the people who can afford one of our very expensive tickets, we got something for you. There's also some unauthorized sing-alongs. People have linked it to the El Teatro Campesino history. That's a farm worker movement in California. It was part of Dolores Fuerte and the United Farm Worker Movement when they were going on strike and they were doing their initial work for Latinos who were frontline workers in the agricultural industry, they would put on actual theater in the camps as a way of keeping spirits up and keeping people informed. It was definitely a link between theater and politics, and more than one commentator has linked that history to the Hamilton show. He also had a mixtape that debuted in 2016 at #1 on Billboard. There were also some musicals that had instrumentals. There were these things called Hamel drops that were songs related to the show, but not performed in the show. There was one about Ben Franklin. There was a Chicago run that had lots of spin-offs. They were named things like the Angelica Tour and the Aunt Peggy Tour. And it's also moved to the West End. So how about that for full circle? The Hamilton show has gone back to Britain, where it is being produced also with Cameron McIntosh. And I think that is currently running. So the show is hugely popular. It starts spreading. It's got roots. It goes in all kinds of directions. And let's just reflect on the success and awards. It won Lin Manuel Miranda the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. There are Emmys, Tonys, Grammys, Kennedy Center honors, 4 honorary doctorates that have all gone to Lin Manuel Miranda for the show. He gets a 3% royalty from that show. That made him $12.7 million early on. It's more now. The cast gets profit sharing. It sold $30 million of tickets before it even opened, which was a record. It sold out its entire engagement by September of 2015. It set a record as being the first ever musical to make $3.3 million in a single week. And when you talk about Broadway, there are people who have written histories about that and said that you can break Broadway into a bunch of eras. But once Cats came out, there were people who were saying, look, there's 2 Broadway eras, before Cats and after Cats, because Cats has sort of rewritten what Broadway is now so convincingly that it has defined what Broadway has become. And I think we're now in a place where you can talk about what is Broadway. Well, there's a before Hamilton and there's an after Hamilton, because after Hamilton, things like multiracial casting and hip hop is a valid musical form for the Broadway audience. Those are just things that are happening. It redefined what it meant to be on Broadway. It was that big a deal. We just have a couple things to wrap up here. What has Lin Manuel Miranda been doing since Hamilton came out and that big show? Well, one key issue is that its use in education. The producers famously got 20,000 New York school kids to come watch it. There were another 20,000 kids in the Chicago version of the show that came up to watch it. And the show has been put into the curriculum. Does kind of press the issue of historical accuracy, but for my money, there's no bad way to make history sexy. That if you get people thinking about it and talking about it, even if it's not, accuracy will matter, but you don't ever even get to the accuracy question if nobody cares. And so getting people to care about, read, and debate historical events, that's an important thing. It's the start of the conversation. So that was one part of the aftermath. Education and discussion about the Constitution and discussion about the founders. That has definitely been sparked as the aftermath of the show. In 2015, there was actually a move to take Alexander Hamilton off the $10 bill, but the show probably stopped that, although in a weird way, there was some discussion about Harriet Tubman being a candidate for both the $10 and the $20 bill, and Trump nixed all of it, so who knows? I'm not sure. Hamilton, did it save him on the $10 bill? Yes. But did that bump Harriet Tubman off the $10 bill? Well, maybe, but did Trump kill all of it? Yes. So who knows? My first experience with Alexander Hamilton, I think in elementary school, was you knew him as the guy on the $10 bill, and that was briefly in question, but that part of the Hamilton legacy seems to have been preserved by the show. The song How Far I'll Go from Moana is a Lin Manuel Miranda song. The song Dos Orguitas from Encanto is also a Lin Manuel Miranda song. Also, the We Don't Talk About Bruno from Encanto went to #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100 in the UK singles. Lin Manuel Miranda was also involved with that. He starred as Jack in the 2018 version of Mary Poppins that got released in theaters. And this is awesome, between 2009 and 2010. So that's just after In the Heights and just before Hamilton. He was in the New Electric Company, that kids educational show. I saw the original Electric Company when I was a kid in the early 1970s, and he was part of the new one. He starred in His Dark Materials. That's an adaptation of a series of novels between 2019 and 2022. And this is fun. In 2023, he was working on a stage adaptation of The Warriors, which is a novel and a cult classic 1979 film. I don't even know how to describe it. You definitely know it's a 70s movie, but it's about a gang in New York City. The plot is they have to fight their way through it, so they keep meeting different gangs along the way. It's kind of a weird one, but definitely a cult classic, and definitely things, especially the football players at my high school, were taken with. There was a concept album in 2024 for that Lin Manuel Miranda was a part of, but that hasn't really developed into anything else yet, but that was only 2024. And awesomely, on January 24th of 2016, he got a cameo offstage role of the loud hailer in Les Mis, fulfilling his lifelong dream of being a part of a Les Mis production on Broadway. So anyway, that's just kind of the various projects that Lin Manuel Miranda has been involved with in the aftermath. Okay, there's one more thing that we need to talk about, and that is the politics of Lin Manuel Miranda. So what do we know? We know about the history of Puerto Rico. We know that there's a New Yorican culture. We know that showed up definitely in the Heights. We know that that influenced Lin Manuel Miranda. We have seen how he got the show In the Heights burst into Broadway. We know about Hamilton, its massive success. But as part of that then, so there's definitely these political themes that are included in and part of the show. But now Lin Manuel Miranda is Lin Manuel Miranda, the hottest property on Broadway, who has redefined the genre. What he does matters, and he's got some celebrity. And what is he going to do? How's he going to incorporate that into the show that is about equality? Well, in 2016, Congress was debating a $70 billion relief package for Puerto Rico after the Hurricane Maria devastated it. And that was part of a larger debt burden problem. He was in favor of the debt relief package, and he personally raised $22 million for the rebuilding after the Maria thing. He's active in the Graham Windham Community Organization, which was founded by Eliza Hamilton. We discussed that in the last episode. There are more fun details there, but essentially Hamilton in the 1800s founded a New York foundation to help children, especially orphan children. Now it focuses on community building, but the actress who played the role of Angelica is part of that. And so is Lin Manuel Miranda, helping boost the work of that organization. Hamilton had a Puerto Rican run with Lin Manuel Miranda, who is back in the starring role. And as part of that, he donated a bunch of money, like $1 million, to renovate the theater and reinvest the proceeds back into the Puerto Rican art scene. But colonialism, it is a wily opponent. You can fight against it, but sometimes it outfoxes you. Lin Manuel Miranda backed the Promesa Act, PROMESA, which is an acronym for the restructuring for this debt act. It was supposed to address the Puerto Rican debt, but it resulted in austerity measures that produced the closure of something like 200 public schools. And so Lin Manuel Miranda backed that act. Then it went through. It resulted in a huge cuts to public education, which is exactly the opposite, certainly of what Lin Manuel Miranda wanted. There were protests that against the government, but also against Lin Manuel Miranda's shows and his productions of Hamilton. To his credit, Miranda came out and addressed the crowds directly, and he agreed that the act had not lived up to its promise, and he switched his support to total debt relief. Now, you will not be surprised to hear that the Trump administration has not acted to give total debt relief to Puerto Rico, although I will say you could erase the entire debt of Puerto Rico in what we spent in about 3 days on the Iranian military conflict. But as far as Lin Manuel Miranda is concerned, I think he was legitimately trying to help Puerto Rico, thought that we should do something to get rid of the debt. The only thing that was there was that act. The act then ending up with lots of public cuts. That was a political misstep on his part. He has worked with the Rockefeller Foundation and some others to found the Hamilton Education Program and HAM for Progress. He worked with Michelle Obama on voter turnout and pressed for it in a number of different areas. And he's been outspoken on addressing homelessness, Asian American and Pacific Islander representation, and promoting Voices for Black History Month. And he has supported both Planned Parenthood and trans youth. So that is the laundry list of things that Lin Manuel Miranda has gotten involved with. I just mentioned them in the list form to give you a sense of how extensive his work with the community has been. Okay, so let's give a final take on Lin Manuel Miranda, that there are critics who feel that as a mainstream work within the system guy, he's pushing in the wrong direction. He definitely got on the wrong side of the Puerto Rican debt relief question. And so those have been some missteps. And then there, of course, those who just think that people who are celebrities should stay out of politics, or people who don't like what they call the Hollywood elite, which probably includes Lin Manuel Miranda as well, and their involvement in politics. What do we make of all that? Is he a net step backward? Is he doing the good things? Is he doing bad things? Well, here's my take. Lin Manuel Miranda took a bunch of chances, and very predictably, in every case, they were always in the direction of inclusion, including stronger voices for women, including actors of color, including street forms of music into a traditional Broadway canon. He has been involved in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican issues, both the hurricane relief and the debt relief, and taking his show back to Puerto Rico so he would personally be a force reinvesting in the arts in Puerto Rico. He's been involved in education and women's rights. He took the shot with profit sharing with the actors to sort of model what it is the biggest shows should do. If the biggest shows do it, that puts pressure on other people to do it. And all of those were big swings that were trying to make show business itself more inclusive and the education system more revitalized and the nation of Puerto Rico a stronger, more thriving arts community. He wanted to make shows that looked more like the country as it existed, to tackle some big inequities and use his platform for good. Not all of them have been hits. Not everything has worked out exactly the way you would want it to work out. But I think if you balance it all out, you would say, is this guy a poser or is he legitimately trying to improve the world? I think you would say he is legitimately trying to improve the world. And if you think charity and philanthropy are the wrong way to do it, if you think that his view of history isn't that great because you hate Alexander Hamilton, you've got some points to raise and some issues to raise in the debate. But if you just look at Lin Manuel Miranda and say, has he very consistently been trying to make the world a better place? Was he born into a family with some wealth and some privilege? Yes. Did he turn out like Elon Musk? Definitely not. Has he consistently tried to use his platform and his talent to advocate for others and create spaces, taking artistic chances to open up space for people who are traditionally excluded? I think the answer is yes. And we all know the Teddy Roosevelt quote that the person who gets the credit is the one in the arena making the fight, and that maybe that counts for more than the voices of the critics. That if you are a critic and you don't like what he's doing, you certainly have the right to speak. Your point of view is important. That is valuable. It's part of the discussion. But is it more impressive to be the guy in the arena, taking the shots, making the decisions, taking the risks, and living or dying on the consequences of those choices? I'm impressed. Yes, I think that that's a little bit harder to do. And I think Lin Manuel Miranda has worn it about as well as anybody can. Okay, just to kind of wrap it all up, Hamilton, the show worked artistically, and those artistic successes have social commentary baked into them. Most critics acknowledge that the show worked great artistically. Those who don't are in a tiny minority. And the box office pretty much tells you how the audience voted. Donald Trump can basically kill any Republican primary candidate who will not toe the line and do exactly what he wants him to do. But he could not do anything to the show Hamilton. He could call for a boycott, and it was just not going to matter. And I think that tells you something about the way the show resonated with people. If Lin Manuel Miranda's point was, I want to write a show where I can tell a story about the founding of America, which was largely a white enterprise, that will resonate with people who look like America today, he could not possibly have succeeded more convincingly. He is a guy who, in my view, walks the walk, that it's possible to preach inclusion and not have that show up in your life. And I think that it does show up in his. He doesn't always avoid mistakes, but who does? You know, politics is tough, and it's a buzzsaw that cuts just about everybody. You just hope it doesn't cut off a very important limb and that you live to fight another day. His Puerto Rican debt relief thing was definitely a miss, but overall what he has been doing is putting his money where his mouth is for sure, and he's pushing in the right direction. Okay, now there is one element of the show that is front and center that we have mentioned repeatedly but have not yet done a deep dive into, and that is the choice of hip-hop as the style of music that drives the show. It is the key to the show, and there's a lot of critical commentary on it that discusses whether or not it's good or bad. The first generation of hip-hop does not always trust the second generation of hip-hoppers, and the hardcore in the community do not always trust those who are commercially successful. Where does Hamilton fit into all of that? Is Lin Manuel Miranda a true believer? Is he a key voice of hip hop? Is he a sellout? Is he something in between? We will go backstage and find out the answer to that question in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.